everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Inner Typewriter, the show with typewriters, coffee, and conversations about how to make our writing better. I'm your host, Scott Calhoun, and with me today is Diana Kelly. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you very much, Scott, for having me. I feel honored.
Oh, yes, that's wonderful. We love having authors, and your book that you've brought today is called The Sky Turned Green and the Grass Turned Blue.
Diane's story.
Diane's story, a memoir, right?
Yes, it is a memoir.
And that is the subject of today's show, is we're going to be learning how to write a memoir, and can we all write memoirs, and who should write memoirs and who shouldn't write memoirs. First, maybe just tell us a little bit about this memoir.
Well, this story that I wrote is about my personal journey as a significant other to a male to female transsexual. And Jay and I were together for 10 years, and 7 years into the relationship, he came out to me to tell me that he wanted to transition to become a female. And this was in the late 1990s when very few understood what it meant to be transgender, let alone understood what it meant to be transsexual. And so, like so many others at that point in time may have been, I was totally confused and didn't understand. And so it sent me off on my own journey to discover what it meant and how is it going to affect our relationship. And ultimately, should I stay or should I go?
Wow.
So that's what the book's about.
Wow. And then while this was happening, at what point did you think, I have to be writing this down? There's a book here. I mean, when did that even occur?
I think that it started with me probably 2 to 3 years into Jay's transition. So that would be probably 2 or 3 years after he came out to me that he wanted to do the transition. And part of that was because during this process, I was trying to discover what it meant, what it was that Jay wanted to do and what that was going to mean to the relationship, and there was no information. I found 2 or 3 books at the time it was Borders Bookstore in San Francisco, and one of them was True Selves by Mildred Brown, and then the other was a historical book by a Mr. Hurt about third sex, third gender. And that one basically delineated a little bit more about what history said about gender and how many cultures outside of the Western culture actually embraces the difference in gender. And so that helped me understand a little bit more that it wasn't something that was just Jay going through something. It was something that has been going throughout history, and I just needed to learn more about it. So that helped. But other than that, there was very little information. And so I just thought to myself, at some point I need to start writing down what I'm experiencing so that I can help someone else. Because I think I wanted to support significant others who might be going through this, or if there was anyone else out there going through it at that point in the time. Right. I honestly didn't know that anyone else was going through this but me. And I felt very alone and very frightened as far as like what was going to happen to our relationship. And so I thought, well, if I can write about it and it supports someone else's journey, that'd be a good thing.
Yeah, so you were going through something, started looking for research and things that you could learn about it, and maybe there was a book here and a book there, but the one that you really needed of that story wasn't somebody else's story of someone going through what you were going through wasn't on the shelf.
No, it was not at all.
So maybe that's one indicator that people can have that, I should write a memoir, is if you go and look for that resource that you feel like you need, where you wouldn't feel alone, and it's not there.
Yeah.
So that means you be the writer.
Exactly.
Maybe.
Yeah, share your story.
Share your story.
Yeah.
How does someone know if they have a story? I mean, I get a lot of conversations where people will say like, well, this happened to me and this happened to me, but I don't feel like it's a book. So how do you turn something that's real into a whole book? It's like a big deal, right?
Well, in my instance, I have to say that it took me a long time to get started on writing because there was so much emotion, and this is one thing about memoir. You're really extracting yourself out in order to be able to write about whatever it is that you're writing about, and there's a lot of emotion involved. And so I was having a lot of difficulty writing because I was so emotional around it. But in that process, I would write down maybe a sentence here and a sentence there, and I would think to myself, well, did enough happen that I can write a book? Because a book is usually, what, 200, 250, 300 pages. It's like, do I have enough to say that would fill a book? And then I kind of realized that, well, you could write a magazine article. You could write a short story. And there are a lot of ways you could put it out there if you didn't feel like you had enough to write a book. But I think that for someone who has something they really want to express, that if they start with just a few words at first, and maybe a sentence, that they'll find that as they think about it, it evolves. And pretty soon you have a paragraph. And pretty soon after that, you'll find that you have a page, and maybe you have a chapter. And then you keep expanding upon it. And that's basically what I did. I expanded on the memories that I had that I felt were important to share with people. And pretty soon, before I knew it, I had 20 chapters written. That took about a year and a half. And then, of course, by the time I got to the end of the book, I had 289 pages, but about 40 chapters.
Wow.
So
249 pages? So it ended up being 250, just like you thought?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. So anyone embarking on a memoir out there should know that it's going to take, you're going to have to deal with your own stuff, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's not going to be, not necessarily going to be a walk in the park.
No, I think that that's one of the things that a lot of times people don't really understand about memoir is anything that's a nonfiction true story where an author is pulling from the recesses of themselves to write it. It's an emotional journey for the writer, sometimes more so, depending upon what the subject matter is. I mean, if you're going to write about, your experiences in traveling across country and all that, that's a way of having a memoir, and it's a little bit more less personal, but less emotional, maybe, perhaps, in some ways. But if you're writing about family problems or your own personal agonies in life, then you're going to have to deal with the emotion around it too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that when I started writing, I wrote in narrative. Could I write in third person even? No. It was too personal. I had to get my distance from it to start writing.
Wow.
Once I started writing it, I went to third person, and then eventually I went back and looked at the entire manuscript, and I said, okay, I have to put this in first person. This is about me, and I've been trying to be transparent. So, okay, let's do that. And that probably took me 5 years.
Oh my gosh.
To get that redone.
Wow. So that's interesting that you wrote in third person. Was it like Diana came home one day and
yeah.
Oh wow. And you were writing kind of like
exactly.
Interesting.
Past tense on everything.
And that felt it helped you get into it and not have it feel too raw and too like it was.
It was more like I was watching it happen as opposed to experiencing it happen. And then as you start writing in first person, you start feeling the emotion. And then you're grappling with the emotion as you're writing. So, yeah, it takes you a lot of different places for yourself.
So maybe that's something that writers out there can try. If it is an emotionally heavy issue, is to write it in third person.
I think that's a good idea.
As a rough draft and maybe kind of ease into the frigid waters rather than go all in at once with the shock of that. So I'm guessing that means at any point did you make an outline just to kind of like see where the story began, middle, and ended?
I didn't start out that way.
Right.
Basically, I started out writing by going to open mics. Now that sounds maybe strange, but I was having such a hard time writing a story. And I think for my story, one of the biggest hurdles I had to overcome was the fear of whether anyone would accept what I had to say, if anyone would be interested in the story. And I wasn't looking at so much at the commercial angle at that point. It was just the content. It's like no one was writing about this. So if I start writing about it, what's that going to mean?
Yeah. How are people going to react?
Exactly. So I had been holding back in having so much difficulty getting started in the writing. I had happened to go to an open mic venue, and I'd listened to people read. And it was it was clear to me that some of the things that were being read were not the usual. And so I had gone to the person who led the group at the end of it, and I said, I have something I need to write, and I'd like to come and read it, to see what the reactions are. Do you care what it is that I write? Mm-hmm. And the response was, you can write whatever you want. You can come and read whatever you want. Come ahead. So for the next month, I wrote the first chapter. It wasn't the first chapter of the book. It actually ends up being the 16th chapter of the book.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
But I went in with started writing, having to do with a vivid memory I had of an experience I had. And I wrote that, and I went in the next month, and I read it to the group. There were about 20 people present. And I watched the expressions on people's face, and then I waited for the reactions at the end of it to see what happened, to see if anybody would let me know what they thought. And what I got was, are you going to come back and read more?
What happens next?
What happens next? So I thought, okay. So then it started me writing, and I continued to go and still go to the same open mic. But I've gone for the last 10 years, and the first few years were instrumental in helping me write one chapter every month until I got pretty much the rough idea of the chapters down.
How interesting. So you use the open mic monthly thing as almost a pace setter.
Exactly. Now you asked about an outline, whereas I didn't start out with the outline. I'd say probably a year and a half into it, I was writing a lot of short stories. And
unrelated to...
It had also to do with the same subject matter, but they were as short stories as opposed to a novel, for instance.
Right.
And someone said to me, if you decide you want to publish that, nobody reads a collection of short stories anymore. You need to put it into a novel. And I thought to myself, oh no, now what do I do? So talking about an outline, what I did was I went home, I took the first page of every chapter that I had written. I had a glass sliding door mirror in my bedroom, on my bedroom closet. I took some painter's tape, and I took that first page of every single chapter, and I posted it up there on that and made it myself a storyboard, basically. And then I looked at all the chapters, and I started pulling them down and shifting them around and saying, okay, well, what's the chronology here? You have all these stories, and that's great, but is there a chronology? Is there a way you can put this into a book and make it cohesive into something somebody will just sit down and read from cover to cover without interruption? What's going to take them from one chapter to the next? And that took me a while, but I did it.
That's cool. It's cool to actually print your work out and put it on the wall and start moving things around. That's a fun part, because it's like you start connecting the dots. And
exactly.
Oh, what if I put these in this order? And playing. It's like playing with the narrative.
Right, and I found it helped me when I saw it that way. I was able to look at it and say, oh, okay, well, there's a time gap between this story and that story. What happened in between? And sometimes it would bring up other thoughts, and I'd think, okay, well, I can transition that chapter to this other chapter because of this other incident that happened. And, I just slowly put it together that way and transitioned it so that it made it a cohesive.
Was there any research that you did, or you felt that you had to do, and once you had the idea of a book, you're like, oh, now I have to go research, well, what would this be as a book, or did you just go for it and then let the consequences fall where they may?
I kind of went for it. There were things about the book, though, as I was writing, that I needed to research to make sure I had things like names spelled correctly, places. I would go back sometimes and I would look at the places that we had been where incidences occurred, and where we would have an experience of some sort. And I would go back and I would look at the spot and I would think about it to kind of draw back for myself memory and what it was like for me there, sometimes what it felt like being there. Because I will say that the emotions, of course, it took me about 14 years to write it. And during the time I was experiencing it, there was a lot going on and there was a lot of emotion involved with it. So I had to really step back and look at it with some objectivity and say, okay, what did this scene look like? Who was there? How did I feel? And I used what I would research in that way to help me fill in the gaps in the writing. And of course, then there was like, I write about going to City Light Books at one point and noticing some people in reading different books. And I had picked up a book that I remembered only part of the title. And so I had to look things like that up to make sure that I had the information right. So that's the kind of research I did. I did not do such things as watch, for instance, Transamerica when it came out as a movie, Orange is the New Black. I didn't read stories about trans people or individuals because I didn't want anything that was out there that I could have read to influence anything that was my memory of what the situation was. So for that, I just did really very minimal research.
Yeah, so maybe there's a point to that of kind of keeping your memory as the primary source and trying not to let anything influence that, and at least get that down before exposing it to other sort of pop culture interpretations. Did you ever feel like, as you were getting close to completion, that you were missing something, or you needed to add something to kind of jazz it up a little or make it more appealing to like a more commercial approach?
Not really. People would tell me that I had a timely subject, but I was more concerned with telling the truth, making sure that what I said was authentic for what occurred to me and also to Jay at the time, trying to keep it in that nonfiction, authentic spot. And the only thing that I found that I did need to change were the names in order to protect privacy.
I see.
But other than that, pretty much I didn't make any change for any commercial reason at all. Yeah.
The little byline here is my personal journey as a significant other to a male to female transsexual. And to me, that's like, wow. Like right away, what a journey that's going to be. I can already tell that it's going to be an interesting story.
Thank you.
So if someone were to be writing a memoir and create their little byline, maybe that's something they could do, is see what people's reaction to that byline is.
Definitely.
And if they say, wow, that sounds like an amazing journey, like, say no more, like, let's read it. What happens next? But if they have questions or they're confused or, like my journey through college, it's like something's missing. Like, what's the hook, right?
Yes.
Even though it's still nonfiction, it kind of needs a hook, don't you think?
I do think that it does. And usually when you're writing, one of the first things that people will tell you is to consider if you were to tell someone about your book, give them your quote-unquote elevator speech, and in about 3 sentences, explain what your book's about.
Oh man, I'm writing this book, and it's like, oh my god, hey, it's a big publishing executive. Well, I have this idea for a guy with superpowers. Oh no, he didn't like it. Oh, should have practiced more.
And I think that in the beginning that was hard. And I think most people find it's difficult at first to kind of like hone in on what it is they're really writing about. But you do get to that point where you can, and that's where you come in with the bylines and stuff. It's like, okay, that'll help explain it with, and as short as possible.
Right.
If you can do it in 1 sentence as opposed to 3, great. But, that's a good way to look at it, is what would you say to someone if you saw them in an elevator and you wanted to explain what your book was?
Does everything in a memoir have to be true? Is that a rule we have to abide by? Is there any poetic license where, technically, I tripped as we were walking up to the hospital, but I'm just going to pretend that I didn't. I'm just going to leave that out. Does that happen at all?
Well, I think that happens. Yeah, that I think happens. Basically, though, you want to tell the truth because, again, nonfiction, you're hoping that, you're telling the truth. Someone mentioned to me that there is something out there now called creative nonfiction. Now, I honestly don't really know what that means because I didn't look it up. But I like I said, the only thing that I changed in mine were the names of the people involved because they are still living, and I did not want to interrupt their personal privacy or to out them. And for myself, I go by my true name. And I use Diane because that was a nickname that everyone has always used for me, and it fits, and that's fine. But as far as everyone else in the book, I use a made-up name for them. If I was to make this into a film, which is something that I do think of doing, how that would pan out once it's put into a screenplay, I have no idea. And I'm sure that there's a certain amount of change that comes in that to make it fit the format, but right now the story is as true as I can make it.
Right. And then the script writers are like, okay, and here's where the FBI agent comes in and knocks the door down, and you're like, what?
Well, there was no FBI agent.
What's going on?
Yeah.
How many people did you think were out there going through this? And then as you actually released the book, did that turn out to be true, or were you surprised about who was reading it?
Well, it's interesting to me because when I was going through it, of course, I thought there was no one but me. And then I came to realize in time, with the advent of Facebook in particular, that there were a couple of groups out there where there were cisgender, that would be significant others, cisgender significant others, who were with people who were making this change, whether it was male to female or female to male. But that group that I came across only had 21 people in it. So I thought to myself, I'm going to be able to help some people, but basically there's not that many people are going to be interested, that it's going to affect them directly.
In a large population, we should say.
In a large population, yeah.
Only 21 people, not like half the town in a small town, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I wondered whether or not I was really going to have any readership or how I was going to get any word out. But along with all of that, one of the things that I did was I joined a group that was online. It's a TG Guide is what they call it, and it's a forum for transgender. And I had gone on because I was curious about how many people are there out there like me. And so I posted a question on their forums and said to the effect of, is there anyone else out there that needs support as a significant other to someone who is making this transition? Well, within a month, I had 2,000 hits on that question, which said to me, oh my gosh, there are people out there. And it wasn't particularly that I learned later, because the site actually asked me to be, what would you call a moderator for them for a while. And but I was curious, are there significant others that are really wanting to know? Well, it turned out that it was the transgender person who wanted to connect because they either wanted to come out to their loved one and didn't know how, or were afraid to. And so that kind of sent me in a different direction. I realized that maybe I would be helping the significant others, but maybe I'd be helping the transgender person who wanted to come out be able to express to their loved one that they wanted to come out. So it started to kind of morph and take on new life for itself as far as like what the subject matter was and what I was trying to do.
At this point, had you finished writing, or you were still writing?
I was still writing.
Okay.
I was still writing.
So did you take that like, oh, that's interesting, and kind of help guide your writing to also be writing it for that target audience?
No, not really. No, I kept my story as true as I could to what my story and my experience was. But if I would go on the site and I would answer a question, for instance, I would use my experience as to how I dealt with it, but not just say that, basically I was still trying to be supportive. So I would say, because I was able to learn and understand, I would say that there's a possibility that your significant other will be able to learn and understand. And maybe you're not going to lose that person when you come out to them.
Right.
Maybe they're going to understand, or at least you can also refer them to the site, if nothing else at that time, because that was all there was that I found, that might be helpful to them. So, but I didn't change my story in order to change anything about how it was going to affect people.
Right.
I thought my story was enough, and being as transparent as I could about the different subject matter that comes up in this story was needed to be my story.
Yeah, of course. Let's say there's some writers out there who are thinking of writing their memoir. Is there something they could do in the meantime just to prepare for the eventual completion of their book?
I think going to author events is good. Now, I know here we are very fortunate that there are so many writers and writers groups around. There are always classes that people can take to help them with their writing or to help them find direction. But there are groups that you can go to, and you can just listen to the authors come in and express how they wrote their book. I think that helps. I mean, it helped me. I did do that, where I would just say, like, how did you do your book and what inspired you, that sort of thing. Then as you get further into it, which I did the last couple of years of the writing, was I had gotten together with 2 other people, and the 3 of us would get together once every 2 weeks, and we'd sit down and we'd pass around the table a chapter of our book, and we'd read it, discuss it, and they'd take a chapter home with them, and I would take a chapter home with me, and we would review it and make comments, and then come back a couple weeks later and exchange the chapters. And it was a way of having someone else look at it and criticize it, or say, oh, that was a good one. And
like, I cried right here, and you're just like, oh, really? You weren't supposed to cry there. You're supposed to cry here.
It was more like, you did that. So, but I think that getting together with other people can be a good thing. And usually you make those connections by going to either book groups or getting involved in groups that will help you with your writing. And I think that's not a bad idea.
Right. Even if you haven't started yet, you having written a book isn't required to walk through the door.
No.
Your book could be 10 years in the future.
That's right. That's right. And it is inspiring, it does help, and it's supportive, and you're around people who are writing, and you hear their stories, and you realize that the difficulties that you're feeling and that what you're going through, others go through too. So again, you're not alone.
Yeah.
So you have people to ask questions of, so that's good.
Did you ever have people read it who didn't know you? Were you interested in how the total stranger reacted to your book rather than a close colleague?
Definitely, yeah.
How do you go about that?
Well, what I did was I kind of picked up on people. And when it came time to do an advanced reader, for instance, before I published the book, I picked 6 people. Some of the people I had known, but they didn't know the story. Others knew the story, maybe knew part of the story. Some didn't know the story at all. And I just said, I've written a book, and would you be interested in reading it and tell me what you think? And I sent out copies of the manuscript to them and had them read it. And it usually only took anywhere from a week to the longest was 2 weeks for someone to get through the book and get back to me and tell me what they thought. They'd mark up the manuscript and maybe make some suggestions. It gave me a chance to think about what it was that they caught when they were reading. If they found, a lot of times they would look for grammatical errors or sometimes they would reflect on the content, but most of them were really looking at just the story. Did I like the story? Did it move fast? That sort of thing.
And then once you got all that back, was it you made a bunch of changes or just a couple more little changes after that?
Some changes. Sometimes I would think, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, okay, I see how that's sounding to you. And I could word that sentence differently, make it more clear. When it came to dialogue, I had a friend go through and check the dialogue, someone who was very good with dialogue, because I never considered myself a writer in the first place. And I didn't have the formalized training, and I knew someone who was very good at dialogue. So after I'd finished everything, I said, would you go through this one more time for me and tell me what you think about the dialogue? And he went through and hacked it to pieces. It didn't change the content or add to the content, but it was like, okay, you didn't need to say he said, she said. You didn't need to put that in there. You can make it flow quicker this way.
Right. The reader can kind of keep track of who's talking based on context, and every once in a while, oh yeah, she said that. Okay, that's correct.
Yeah. So I did that.
Did you ever have like a reader react one way and another reader react the total opposite way about the same thing, and they like contradicted each other?
No.
Okay, good. That's tough, Someone's like, oh, this isn't funny enough, and someone says, this slapstick is, you don't need that, and
Yeah.
it's like, well, what do you do? I guess they just cancel each other out.
Yeah.
Did you have an editor ever look at it, or was it just these beta readers, and then you felt like it was done?
No, I had 3 editors.
Three editors.
3 editors.
Oh my goodness.
First, I had a lady go through it who basically checked for grammar. I said, I want you to look at sentence structure, grammar. It's those basic things that, I should know, but, you forget once you get out of high school. And she had plenty to say, and, that helped a lot. And then I had a copy editor go through. That was the second one.
Oh, okay.
And she spent some time, about 3 months, with the book, and looked at it and made suggestions and picked up things that the first person didn't pick up. And then I had the person go through it. The person with dialogue went through it, and but when he went through it, he also looked at everything else. And he didn't just stick to the dialogue. So he was checking and still picking up on grammar and various things that he spotted along the way. And all of the things were helpful. Sometimes I would take the suggestions that editors gave, but a lot of times I just left it the way it was. Because sometimes also I realized editors are looking for specific things, and sometimes they weren't so much into the content, but the structure. And I think to myself, like, why would you change that? No. Or if I change that, that's not what the story's about. That's not what the story says.
Right.
So I had to be careful of that. I had to
Right.
watch to make sure that, that any changes I made were still true to the story.
Authentic.
Yeah.
Wow, 3 different editors. It's just, some writers are thinking like, do I need to, get a editor?
Definitely.
An editor?
Because I'll tell you, when you've spent, in my case, good 12 years, and you look at the same story and those same words over and over and over again, and you change them, and you go back and you forth and everything over time, you don't see mistakes anymore. It's so part ingrained into what you have already put out there that if you make a mistake, you're not going to see it. And it can be really blatant to someone who is reading it for the first time, but you would never even think it was there.
Don't even see them, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Final question now. If you were going into a different timeline and starting completely over, or there's people out there who are writing a memoir and you wanted to kind of synthesize, here's the 3 most important things that you could do if you're embarking on a memoir, or you could go back in time and give yourself that advice, maybe is a way to think about it. What would those 3 things be?
Well, one of the things I would do, I would start writing, jot down notes to yourself about different things that you do remember that are important. Things that stand out to you about what it is that you're thinking about writing. It may be the characters that you have or the people that you're having in your story. It could be places of interest that are in your story. Anything that stands out in your memory, maybe jot those things down. Write down the things you want to, make a list of the things that you really want to say. Sometimes that you want to be helpful to people, or sometimes it's like, I don't want to talk about this. I mean, that's helpful too, but it's making a list of things for yourself could be helpful. Also, it's going through and for all of us, or a lot of us maybe, you might have things from the past that help you remember things, whether it's an item or a picture or letters, emails, things that you have used over time that might have meaning to you. Gathering those things together and reviewing them, going through and sorting through them and looking at them sometimes helps bring up memories. So I think that's the hardest part when you're doing the memoir. It's remembering the different things and trying to be as truthful with your memory because sometimes, your memories can get tainted over time. So I think it's important to try to be sure that what you're remembering is what happened. Mm-hmm. And sometimes having these other things around to kind of review help.
The context.
Mm-hmm. Keeps the context, yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think if I was to write another memoir, I would definitely be looking at it from what do I have around that I can use to kind of support what it is that I've said. Mm-hmm. And in the case of this book, I did have a lot of emails and things like that where I'd had conversations with Jay over time. And I didn't use them a lot, but there were times when we had certain arguments or situations come up where we had emailed about it later. I would go back and I'll review those sometimes. Mm-hmm. To see exactly what was said.
Right.
And, I might remember it one way, but it's like, is that really the way it was? Mm-hmm. And make sure that's what was done and said.
And I didn't put this on here because I didn't think of it at the time, so maybe this is a little bit of a curveball. And you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but
okay.
How was your significant other's reaction to all this process?
Well, I only spoke to Jay once about it, and it was about 4 years past our relationship, and where we had gotten together and we were talking, and I expressed that I wanted to write a book about what my experience was with her during this process. And the initial reaction was kind of a surprise. And I always take that surprise as the fact that I don't think that Jay ever imagined that I would ever write anything. So I took that as the reason why, not necessarily why I was writing about us. Mm-hmm. But I explained to her at the time, I said, if you really think about it, so little was known about transsexuality at that point in time. And so much is still not known that I think it's important that I write. And the response after she kind of looked surprised at me was, well, as long as you tell the truth. And I made the comment, I said, I would definitely tell the truth, but remember, it is my story. It's from what I experienced and what my perceptions were and how I reacted to them. Mm-hmm. It isn't really your story. It's about how I was. Right. And I realized when I said that to her that there were things that I write about or ended up writing about in the story that she wasn't even aware of that I experienced and did in order to find out if staying or to stay or to go is something I should do. Mm-hmm. So it is my truth, and I feel like, I said it the best way I could, and hopefully if she reads the story or decides, she wants to read it, that she will enjoy it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again for sharing that, and
thank you.
You've given other people going through similar things a resource that didn't exist before, so that's one of the great gifts that memoir writing can give. So we encourage everyone to get out there and find your truth and tell your story.
Yes, very important. Yes.
And we had this cute little typewriter with us today. This is a Olivetti Latera 25. Oh, if you could just move that cup.
I certainly will.
And see how that feels.
Actually, you want me to put it in?
I don't think it's gonna.
Okay.
I don't think it's gonna. Yeah. Cool.
Oh,
I realized that if we never press the buttons, it's just a tease. So we like to press the buttons sometimes. Yeah, it still works.
It does.
It's good, and everyone watching the show was just waiting for that moment. Like, yeah. But get to the typewriter.
It's
but
great.
Thank you, really. Thanks again. And your memoir again was "The Sky Turned Green and the Grass Turned Blue." Diane's story. Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Scott. I really appreciated speaking with you today. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
And to everybody out there, thanks for watching, and don't forget to follow, share, and subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks.